Welcome to the TTS Talking Educators podcast. Each week, we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe, offering exclusive insights, inspiration, and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years and primary. Hello, my name is Mark Loveday, your host for this week's TTS Talking Educators podcast. I'm the headmaster of Fruin College, an independent co-educational day and boarding school for students aged 7 to 19, specialising in dyslexia and co-occurring specific learning difficulties. I'm a specialist teacher, an SLE specialist leader for SEND, and have taught across primary, secondary and sixth form in both mainstream and specialist settings, holding a variety of leadership roles. I've previously set up and led SEND advisory teaching services, been responsible for the creation of diagnostic pathways for dyslexia, dyscalculia and dyspraxia, and created and led an alternative provision for students experiencing emotional-based school avoidance, which won Alternative Provision of the Year in 2023. I'm a board director for the SBLD Assessment Standards Committee, known as ASC, and a trustee of a multi-academy trust, and I'm a national and international speaker. Throughout this series, we'll be discussing a range of topics aimed at supporting SEND in primary settings, inspiring you with guidance and resources to enhance your practice. I'm delighted to welcome back Michael Surr as today's guest. Welcome back, Michael. How are you?
Thank you. I'm great. Thank you.
Good.
It's good to be here.
Well, nice to have you back. Before we get started, could you just give a bit of a quick introduction to yourself for our listeners?
Yep. So I'm head of education at NASEN, which is the National Association for Special Educational Needs. We are a charity and a membership organisation. My background is in primary teaching, and I have also been a SENCO and a deputy head as well. I've also been a SEND advisory teacher for a local authority, which meant that I was also then able to work in secondary and a little bit in early years and FE as well. And my work at NASEN is to oversee the work of the education team.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Michael. In this episode, we'll be looking at the role of the SENCO and also support staff, and looking at that kind of wider whole school collaboration too. So I think, shall we start with the big one, really? And let's get some clarity around what is a SENCO and what does the SENCO do in a school?
Wow. Okay. You could. I could. Counter that with another question: what doesn't a SENCO do?
Absolutely.
It sometimes feels like it always feels like they do an awful lot. As well as SEND, they're often safeguarding leads. They may oversee English as an additional language, attendance, lots of other roles, and lots of them are also part of senior leadership teams as well. So incredibly busy people, I would say. In terms of SEND specifically, what do they do? I think the key for me is it's that if we think about what SENCO actually means, it's a Special Educational Needs Coordinator. So that means they're the strategic lead for SEND in a school. And something that I sometimes say is that means they are SENCOs, not SENDos. So they're not the ones delivering the provision or necessarily making the provision. They're the ones who have that oversight and work towards making sure that needs are identified effectively, and that the provision is made and that provision is evaluated for effectiveness. They're also heavily involved and tend to lead on applications for education, health and care plans and collating all of that information. They're a key point of contact for parents of children and young people with special educational needs. And they also work quite closely with external agencies as well. I think for me, the role of SENCO is it's quite a unique one. SENCos can feel quite isolated in school. They can sometimes feel like they're a lone voice in advocating for our children and young people with SEND. But it's an incredibly diverse role. And it is the only role in school for which you have to be a qualified teacher as well. I think that's quite important to acknowledge, and actually speaks to the status of the role as well.
Absolutely, and I think I really like that. SENCO, not send do, and I think that's really important. And I think the new code is really clear on that. The old, you're going to go out with the SENCO and do some reading support. That's not their role, and I think that's really important. We picked. Sorry.
So I was just going to jump in there and to say as well, and that speaks to something you mentioned in a previous edition, Mark, about every teacher is a teacher of SEND, because the SENCO isn't necessarily the one delivering the provision, but similarly, every leader is also a leader of SEND. So where SEND is working well, where SEND provision is working well in a setting, it should very much be a collaborative effort amongst everybody in the setting, including parents, and I would say as well the children and young people themselves, but it's the SENCO who coordinates that.
Absolutely, and it's that kind of co-production, that three-legged stool, as we always talk about, in terms of school, parents, and pupil, really working together to get the best possible outcomes for all. So we've kind of looked at that role a little bit of the SENCO. It's such a huge role, and as you rightly say, the only one that requires qualified teacher status to give it that gravitas. I mean, they often oversee a team of teaching assistants across the school. Now, when it comes to the role of teaching assistants, as we all know across school, your staffing is your most expensive outgoing, but it's also incredibly your most precious resource as well, around enabling them, upskilling them, supporting them to go out to deliver the best for our young people. But in terms of that research around the teaching assistants, we still see nationally this idea of a one-to-one, and this kind of this notional budget, this SEND support fund that schools access, just being purely spent on, right, here's a one-to-one to enable you to access that learning, when all the research really points to the fact that pupils make less progress with that one-to-one. How can we effectively deploy teaching assistants, kind of remodeling how we use them?
Lots to unpick in that. I think one of the places to start would be to have a look at the Education Endowment Foundation guidance on using and working with teaching assistants. So I would absolutely recommend having a look at that. And not to plug it too much, but going back to the whole school SEND review guides, there is a deployment of teaching assistants review guide as well, that can support schools to reflect on how they are using their support staff to make sure that they are as effective as they possibly can be. I think it's interesting, this notion of one-to-one, and in some instances it can be seen as a silver bullet or the thing that we should be aiming for. I have to say, even in special schools, having someone one-to-one to support a child doesn't happen very often. So even in special schools, it's not something that happens very often. And I think having someone attached to a child in that way isn't particularly helpful, especially where we maybe are drifting towards what some people call Velcro syndrome. So a child ceases to be able to function unless that they've got an adult with them, prompting them, making sure they've got their resources, and so on. If we think about what education is for, it is about preparation for adulthood. So at some point, children will leave education and be in the world of work, of adult life, where they won't have someone next to them doing that prompting and making sure they've got everything that they need. So similarly, in school, we need to make sure that we have that end goal in mind, so that, yes, there is support available, but considering, is one-to-one actually the most appropriate thing? It can also mean as well, and I've seen examples of this throughout my career, where it actually becomes a barrier to a young person being able to interact with their peers, which is that social development is just as important actually as academic development. So you don't want that adult getting in the way of that social development with peers either.
No, I completely agree. It is that, as you said, that kind of Velcro syndrome, and that that actually the adult starts to talk for the child becomes isolated in a very similar manner actually to students in the classroom who may be the only ones using a laptop. That adult barrier, we've got a screen barrier. It's preventing possible interaction. Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about that the deployment of teaching assistants, though, again, it's empowering our classroom teachers, particularly in the primary years, to be thinking about how they can creatively deploy teaching assistant support across the classroom, rather than purely having that one-to-one, or they work with that group. It is really important that classroom teachers are driving it.
It is, and again, you asked in a previous episode about initial teacher training or initial teacher education. I'm not aware of much input around how to work with teaching assistants as a teacher. I mean, it's a very long time ago now, but when I trained, I know that I had no input at all. So just kind of had to learn that as I went along. There is also the difficulty as well of who manages the deployment of teaching assistants, because ideally it's the SENCO who's got the overview of what's happening in school, who would be best placed to do that, but it isn't always the SENCO.
This is down to classroom practitioners deploying them how they see fit in terms of knowing their students and knowing how best to support them.
Yes. So I think one of the key elements for effectively utilising support staff, teaching assistants, is that there is opportunity in whatever form it takes for teachers and teaching assistants to be able to communicate with each other and collaborate. That is challenging, because some teaching assistants will only be employed from the start of the school day and then will finish at the end of the school day, which means they don't then have an opportunity to speak with teachers. That goes back to the questions about budget, but where if where that is the case, it's thinking about, so how can we communicate in a different way? Maybe it's I know some schools use simple record sheets where any sort of points that a class teacher needs to be aware of, the teaching assistant can make a note of it. And similarly, the class teacher can make notes about things that the support staff or the teaching assistant would need to be aware of. There's also a different way that teaching assistants can be utilised. So some teaching assistants will support quite generally around SEND, whereas some will develop specialisms. So you may have a dyslexia specialist teaching assistant, for example. I think that's potentially quite a good model because, again, what it means is it's not just all about the SENCO and everybody reaching out to the SENCO, but also it really does raise the status of teaching assistants because they would then be seen as a specialist in a particular area. So it really does help to raise their status as well.
Absolutely. And I think it comes down to investment, doesn't it? I mean, it is moving very much from that model of just having a presence. Oh, it's okay. Class 1 have got X amount of support to that active engagement. And if we think about that significant cost, particularly with all, the cost of employment and contributions going up as well across our schools, thinking about the cost of our staffing, how we effectively and actively engaging our support staff to be active within our children's learning and indeed our planning and assessment processes.
Yeah. Sorry, there was just another point that occurred to me. So something I used to do with teaching assistants that I worked with as a class teacher was to utilise them in supporting me to model certain approaches, having those conversations around what I was teaching, but it gives another person that you can utilise as part of your whole class delivery as well. So it's not just about supporting individual pupils, or even just working with groups. You can utilise them for input around whole class as well.
Absolutely. And just building on that, sorry, I don't want you to carry on. I don't want you to lose your train of thought on that one.
There is a challenge with support staff at the minute, so that there does seem to be quite a shortage in a number of schools. They just can't recruit them. So that does have its own challenges, but where you are utilising support staff, and it keeps coming back to this idea of provision management and the strategic role of the SENCO, the impact of teaching assistants also needs to be evaluated because they are an expensive resource. Staff are always the most expensive resource in any organisation, let alone schools. So you want to make sure that they are actually making a positive difference.
Completely. And just to pick up on the point that you made around that utilising and modelling approaches, but also thinking about building that time in to have those conversations, because it could be a situation where the class is split in terms of teaching input between the teacher and the TA. I mean, we think about the model of, say, talking partners or talk partners in primary schools. 15 pairs talking at once is not conducive to effective working memory or processing. But splitting that class into two, with the TA modelling something or going through some work and the teacher doing an alternative task for the group, that's far more powerful in terms of that engagement and meaningful learning.
Yeah, and on that, I think something that needs to be consciously thought about is ensuring that the teaching assistant isn't always working solely with the children and young people with SEND, because the teacher also needs to do that. So it's important that both work with all children at some point.
Completely. And it's, like you say, it's about measuring that impact as well. I think we've got some real core takeaways from this session around TAs. Thank you, Michael. I think, first of all, part of that provision management, what is the impact of what is a very costly resource in terms of the difference that that's making to our students' learning, but also thinking about that, that intervention work that they're doing. How much are we investing in our TAs in terms of their CPD, their training, this idea that each of them specialising potentially in a core area of need really does, raise the profile across the school, but also supports the SENCO in delivering that kind of coordination of provision across the school. So again, huge thank you for today and sharing those valuable insights as ever. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Educators podcast with me, Mark Loveday, and Michael Surr. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear of future episodes and also to access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your settings and links to relevant resources.